They say to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But what do when the enemy sleeps down the hall, eats your food, and tries to steal the loyalty of your own wife? All under the roof of the house you paid for. My name is Ben. I am 37 years old. And for 6 agonizing months, I was a king living in exile in my own castle. My wife's parents, Helen and George, came into my home feigning helplessness, and then began a systematic campaign to dethrone me. They chipped away at my authority daily, believing my patience was a sign of weakness. They didn't realize they weren't just testing a man's patience. They were awakening a beast. This isn't just a story about overbearing in-laws. This is a detailed account of psychological warfare and a masterclass in how to plan, execute, and win the battle for your own soul and your own home. It began with a phone call that was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. My wife, Sarah, came to me with tears in her eyes, phone still in her hand. Her parents, Helen and George, were losing their home. The landlord is selling, Ben. They have nowhere to go, she'd relayed. The story was packaged perfectly, a tragic tale of 2 seniors being cast out into the cold. Of course, I agreed they could stay with us. In that moment, refusing would have made me a monster in the eyes of the woman I loved. I see now that this was their opening move. They didn't just ask for help. They created a scenario where I had no choice but to let them in. The Trojan horse had been wheeled through my front gate, and I was the one who opened it. The first 2 weeks were a masterclass in infiltration. Helen, a woman who had previously only ever offered passive-aggressive critiques of Sarah's cooking, was suddenly a whirlwind of domestic perfection. She'd cook my favorite meals, quoting recipes she'd saved just for me. George, a man I'd always found gruff and dismissive, became my biggest fan. He'd ask my opinion on politics, compliment my work ethic, and listen with rapt attention as I talked about my hobbies. It was disarming, intoxicating even. They were studying my defenses, my routines, my weaknesses. I now know this phase for what it was, intelligence gathering. The first probing attack came, disguised as a favor. I have a small collection of vintage watches, nothing extravagant, but they hold immense sentimental value. One, in particular, was my grandfather's. I came home to find Helen in my bedroom, a dust cloth in hand. "Just giving the place a little spruce, dear," she'd said, with a radiant smile. Later that evening, I noticed my watch box had been moved, and when I opened it, the watches had been helpfully rearranged and polished, with a harsh, abrasive silver polish, leaving faint scratches on the acrylic face of my grandfather's watch. When I tried to explain, my voice trembling with contained rage, she burst into tears. "I was only trying to help. I can't do anything right." Sarah rushed to comfort her, and I was instantly cast as the villain. The ungrateful brute who made his caring mother-in-law cry for the crime of trying to help. It was a brilliant move. She established a precedent. Her actions were beyond reproach, and my reactions were the problem. The second attack was from George. It was more direct, a test of my territorial boundaries. He started small, parking his oversized car in my spot in the garage, forcing me to park on the street. Then, he took over the main television. My evenings, once a quiet time for me and Sarah to decompress, were now held hostage by his blaringly loud war documentaries and political talk shows. He never asked, he just took. When I mentioned it to Sarah, she'd sigh and say, "Dad's just set in his ways, Ben. It's not worth a fight." They were conditioning her, conditioning both of us, teaching us that resisting them was more trouble than it was worth. The invasion was well and truly underway, and I was losing ground every single day. The phase of subtle jabs and plausible deniability was short-lived. Once they felt they had established a foothold, their campaign escalated into open warfare. Their objective was clear, not just to coexist, but to conquer, and my home was the battlefield. Helen's theater of operations was the kitchen and the social fabric of the house. The critiques of my coffee and eating habits became outright sabotage. I'd come home after a brutal day at work, looking forward to the steak I had planned for dinner, only to find she had used it to make a stew for lunch, for herself and George. "Oh, I hope you don't mind, dear," she'd say, not even looking at me. It just looked like it was about to turn. She began, accidentally, shrinking my favorite sweaters in the wash, claiming my washer and dryer were terribly confusing. Each incident was a tiny pinprick, a death by 1,000 cuts, designed to make me feel powerless and incompetent in my own home. George, meanwhile, launched a campaign of social sabotage. He was a man who craved an audience, a court, and he decided my home was his new throne room. He began inviting his friends over unannounced for poker nights. These were loud, boisterous affairs that went late into the night, filling my house with the smell of stale beer and cigar smoke. When I confronted him, he laughed it off. "Lighten up, Ben. A man needs his friends." He started lending out my tools to his buddies without asking. My expensive power drill, my ladder, my pressure washer. They all vanished for weeks at a time. When I protested, he'd use the ultimate weapon against me. "Sarah, Ben's getting so uptight, isn't he? I worry about his stress levels," he would say to her with performative concern, loud enough for me to hear from the next room. This was their most brilliant and cruel tactic, driving an emotional wedge between me and my wife. They positioned themselves as her allies, her protectors, against her moody, controlling husband. They would corner her when she got home from work, before I had a chance to even speak to her, filling her head with their version of the day's events. It was never, "I used Ben's steak." It was, "Poor Ben was so angry about dinner, you should talk to him." It was never, "I invited my friends over," without asking. It was, "Ben seems so antisocial lately. Is everything okay with him?" Our evenings became tense. Arguments started over things that were never the real issue. We'd fight about the electricity bill instead of the fact that George left every light in the house on. We'd bicker about the grocery budget instead of the fact that Helen was cooking for an army. They were puppeteers, and Sarah and I were the marionettes, dancing to their tune of chaos. I felt a cold dread creeping into my heart. I wasn't just losing my house. I felt like I was losing my wife. The isolation was nearly complete. They had me surrounded, cut off from my reinforcements, and they were preparing for the final assault. Every man has a line, a sacred boundary that when crossed, changes the rules of engagement entirely. My line was my father. He passed away a few years ago, and my home office is, in many ways, a shrine to him. It holds his books, his old desk, and on the wall, his framed military service medals. It is a room of quiet and respect. The one place I had declared, in no uncertain terms, was completely off limits. I had to work late one night, a project that kept me at the office until almost 10 p.m. I came home, exhausted, wanting nothing more than to sit in my father's chair and decompress. I opened my office door, and the scene that greeted me stopped my heart. The room was in chaos. George had decided to finally fix the wobbly leg on my father's desk. My father's desk. The desk was flipped on its side. Tools were scattered across the floor, and on the floor, next to an overturned can of wood stain, was the shattered glass and splintered frame of my father's medals. He hadn't just moved them. He had knocked them off the wall, stepped on them, and tried to hide the evidence under a pile of rags. George stood there, looking not apologetic, but annoyed, as if I had interrupted him. "Damn thing fell off the wall," he grumbled. "Flimsy hook." The lie was so blatant, so disrespectful, it transcended anger and became something cold and clear. This was not an accident. This was a desecration. A final, absolute statement of his dominance. He was showing me that nothing was sacred, that not even the memory of my father was safe from his entitlement. He had taken what was most precious to me and literally ground it under his heel. I didn't say a word. I walked past him, knelt, and carefully picked up the broken frame. I looked at my father's medals, now scratched and dirted, and in that moment, the man who had tried to be patient, the husband who had tried to keep the peace, died. And someone else was born, a strategist, a warrior, a king ready to reclaim his throne, no matter the cost. I left the house. I drove to a 24-hour diner, sat in a booth with a cup of black coffee, and I didn't just write a speech. I drafted a battle plan. This would not be an emotional outburst. This would be a cold, calculated, multi-stage campaign of psychological and financial revenge. I would not just evict them from my space. I would dismantle their entire power structure. I would expose their lies, neutralize their leverage, and re-establish my rule in a way they could never challenge again. My revenge would be the absolute and total restoration of order. My order. My campaign, which I codenamed Operation Homecoming, had 3 phases. Each was designed to systematically strip them of their power and expose them for what they were: manipulative, parasitic liars. Move 1. The financial shock and awe. The next morning, I didn't initiate a conversation. I waited until Helen and George were having their morning coffee, and I placed a folder on the table in front of them. Inside was not a list of rules. It was a professionally drafted, legally binding lease agreement. "What the hell is this?" George sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "That is a rental contract," I said calmly, taking a sip of my own coffee. "It stipulates that as of the 1st of next month, you will be paying fair market rent for your room, plus a 1/3 share of all utilities. I've even backdated it for the last 6 months of non-payment, which comes to a total of £4,200 in arrears, to be paid immediately." Helen gasped. "You can't be serious, Ben. We're family." "Family helps each other," I replied, my voice like ice. "Parasites take without asking. You have acted like the latter. Therefore, you will now be treated as tenants. Sign it, and we can discuss a payment plan for the arrears. Refuse to sign it, and this becomes a formal eviction notice, giving you 30 days to vacate my property." Their greatest weapon, the family argument, had been neutralized with a single legal document. They were speechless. Move 2. The information bomb. As expected, once I left for work, they descended on Sarah, a whirlwind of tears, accusations, and victimhood. They told her I was a tyrant, that I was trying to make them homeless, that I had lost my mind. This was the moment I had anticipated, the moment for my second move. I had made a few calls the night before, one to a friend who worked as a letting agent in their old town. I had Sarah put them on speakerphone, and I listened to their performance for a full 5 minutes. Then I spoke. "Helen, George, that's a very compelling story. But I'm curious, does it include the part where you were evicted from your last property for 3 months of unpaid rent and multiple complaints from neighbors about noise and property damage? Or the part where your landlord selling the house was actually you being kicked out?" The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. I had called their bluff and exposed their foundational lie. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide, then at her parents' faces on the video call, which were pale with shock and guilt. Their credibility, not just with me, but with their own daughter, was utterly destroyed. "You have until tonight to sign the lease," I said, and hung up. Move 3. The coronation. That evening was the final act. The confrontation. I walked into the living room, where they sat with Sarah. The signed lease was on the coffee table. I didn't gloat. I simply laid out the new terms of their existence. The same rules as before, but now they weren't requests. They were clauses in a contract they had signed, a contract I would enforce to the letter. I finished by picking up the broken frame of my father's medals. "And finally," I said, looking directly into George's eyes, "you will pay for the professional restoration of this, out of your first month's rent, as a security deposit against any future damages to my property or my family." The man who had laughed at me, disrespected me, and desecrated my father's memory couldn't even look at me. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had been comprehensively and completely defeated, not by yelling, but by strategy, not by anger, but by facts. It wasn't a truce. It was an unconditional surrender. They stayed for another 4 months. 4 quiet months, in which they were the perfect tenants. They paid their rent on time. They were quiet. They were practically invisible. The fear of legal consequences and the shame of their exposure had done what no amount of polite requests ever could. It had taught them respect, a forced respect, perhaps, but respect nonetheless. When they left, there were no handshakes, no goodbyes. They simply vanished, leaving behind a paid-up rental ledger and a restored frame of medals on my office wall. The victory wasn't in driving them out. The true revenge was in forcing them to live under my roof, on my terms. To pay for the privilege of staying in the home they had tried to conquer. It was in the quiet, undeniable proof that I was the one in control. My relationship with Sarah healed and became stronger than ever. We were a team, united against an external threat. She saw her parents for what they were, and she saw me as the man who had protected our family and our home. So here is my lesson for every man whose home is being invaded. Do not absorb the initial attacks. Do not rationalize disrespect. Identify your leverage. Is it financial? Is it legal? Is it informational? Find it and be prepared to use it without mercy. Your home is not a democracy. It is a kingdom, and a king who will not defend his throne will soon find himself without one. Let them call you cruel. Let them call you the bad guy. Every king is a villain in the story of those he has defeated. That is how I won my war. Now, tell me about yours. What was your checkmate move? What was the moment you stopped being a guest in your own home and took back your crown? I want to hear your stories of victory. Maybe your story will help others, teach them to handle family issues the right way, maybe better than I did mine. I am sending this message to kings and queens out there. Please, never, ever give up on protecting your home and that which is yours.